Another day, another video about the C70. And I wanted to do a somewhat mini review about the camera, but unfortunately I didn't have it for long enough, or at least I didn't really have enough time to really play with it. So in this video, I'm only going to compare the image quality of the C70 to our C300 Mark III, because this is something that I was really interested in about when I had it for the first time, because it's missing RAW, it has really compressed codecs, and I really wanted to know how it holds up to our really expensive C300 Mark III when shooting in RAW. And here I want to give a quick shout out to Digital Store Vienna, where we get all of our equipment, and they were so kind to actually lend us the camera for a couple of days to play around with. And they're so kind to actually let us test out a lot of new equipment, and I really appreciate that. When I got the camera, Canon told me that I'm not allowed to show any kind of sample footage because it's still a pre-production model. But then one day before I had to return it, they hit me up and say, if you label it a pre-production model sample, then this is actually fine. Unfortunately, I didn't really have enough time to shoot an entire project on it like we usually do on this channel. So I just went out with Bell and just did some basic tests and also compared it to the C300 Mark III. Unfortunately, it started raining, so the footage really isn't the best, but I definitely did get a feel for it, what it is all about, and what the quality is compared to the C300 Mark III. So now that we got all of this out of the way, let's actually roll the intro and start talking about the camera. If you haven't seen my first video where I talk about the C70, my first impression holding the camera, using the camera, the body, and basically the overall specs, then go ahead and watch this right now. I link it up here. But now we're talking a little bit more about the image quality compared to the C300 and also who this camera is actually going to be for. Obviously, one of the things that people are missing the most is the missing RAW capabilities of the C70. And although I think that Canon RAW is a little bit overrated because it definitely doesn't pack as many information and as much flexibility as, let's say, Red RAW, it's still a great codec because it's relatively small, it's somewhat easy on your computer considering how much information you have in that RAW codec. And that was also one of my biggest worries when it came to the C70, especially shooting on SD cards. We can't even shoot an all-I codec when shooting higher than 30 frames. And a lot of our work revolves around slow motion and 50 frames. So having to use a long GOP codec is actually something that I was worried about the most. One of my main concerns was how my computer is actually able to edit these files, and having the EOS R5, I hate having to transcode everything whenever I want to shoot something, and when the C70 would replace my C300 Mark III as a main shooting camera, I really wouldn't want to go through that process. And although the C70 shoots an H.265 10-bit 422 codec, which in theory is pretty similar to the one on the EOS R5, my computer had absolutely no problems of handling these files. I could play them back in the browser or put them in a 4K timeline, and when I was slowing them down or even not slowing them down, I had absolutely no problem of playing them back or even editing them. And that is the H.265 codec. The long GOP XFAVC codec gave my computer a little bit of a hard time, but I don't think that's too much of an issue because you have so many other options to choose from. You can choose the H.265 that I was just talking about, and at least on my computer this works well, but if your computer isn't as strong as mine, you can always go down to 420, where you will virtually not see a difference in most of the scenarios, but this codec will edit fine on most computers these days. And now let's actually look at some test footage, because I was a little worried about that we have such a compressed codec compared to our C300 Mark III that I would immediately be able to tell the difference. And looking at those side by side, we shot them in 25 frames with the XFAVC All-I codec, and here I could hardly tell the difference between the two. Yes, the C300 Mark III shot in RAW is a little bit more detailed, but not by that much, and definitely not justifying twice the price. Same goes for the slow motion in 50 or 60 frames. It's still really close, and again, you can see a little bump in detail when it comes to the C300 Mark III in RAW, but compared to the XFAVC or the H.265 on the C70, it actually compares very, very well. And the loss of detail on the C70 comes from adding a little bit of noise reduction, and you can clearly see that the C300 Mark III has a little bit more noise in the shadows where the C70 doesn't, but that comes at a price of a little bit of less sharpening and less detail, and you can clearly see that the C70 adds a tiny bit of noise reduction when looking at those structures, for example in her jacket or in her hair. So yes, looking at them side by side, you can definitely tell that the C300 is a little bit sharper, and I'm not even 100% sure that by the time I upload this to YouTube, you are able to tell the difference. But if you are, yes, you can tell a difference. But then again, when just looking at one of the two and not having them side by side, I'm not even 100% sure if somebody could tell the difference or if it really does matter that much. And I was really surprised about that. Next up, I also did an underexposure test, because this is something that I sometimes do when I really want to preserve the highlights and I have a really high dynamic contrast kind of situation. So I underexpose my model by a little bit just to preserve all the highlights from clipping, and then I just bring them back up in post. And in my test here, I did an extreme test and I underexposed by about 4 to 5 stops. So something that I wouldn't really want to do in the real world. But here, it was really surprising to me that the C300 was completely destroyed by the C70. Raising both of them up, you can definitely tell that the C300 has so much more noise compared to the C70. Obviously, the C70 shoots in an XF-AVC codec, so again, as I've mentioned earlier, it does add a little bit of noise reduction, and RAW doesn't do this at all. But I also thought that having more information and a little bit more latitude and gigabits per second, we would actually even this out. But in my test, the C300 was completely destroyed by the C70, so there is even a quality difference when shooting on the C70 in XF-AVC over the C300 Mark III shooting in RAW. Another scenario I wanted to test out was here in the studio, because if I were to get the C70 as my main camera, then this would be something I would do a lot of. I'm currently shooting on the C300 Mark III in RAW, which is what I usually do for these talking heads, and I wanted to see a side-by-side comparison. And here we render the exact same results that we did outside when shooting with Bell. The C300 is a little bit more detailed, but it really isn't that much. Yes, you do have a slight quality difference, and for all of these tests I was shooting on the Sigma 18-35 on the C300 Mark III and the 28-70 2.0 RF lens on the C70, and both of those are really sharp and great lenses, and I shot both of them at an aperture of 2.0. Next up, I also did a really quick and dirty low light test, and for this I also did this here in the studio. I switched off my key light, turned on the room ceiling light, and bumped the ISO all the way up to 25,600. And needless to say, none of these cameras did a great job. The noise level is somewhat around the same, but what I found is that the C300 Mark III in RAW actually renders the colors a lot better in this low light situation than the C70 does. I also brought the C70 with me on a commercial job that we had just as a test camera, and I didn't really use it for the commercial job as it is still a pre-production model, but I wanted to see how it matches up with the C300 Mark III in a real world scenario as a potential B cam. And here they actually match up to a T. We shot a lot of interviews there, and we all shot this in 25 frames, XF-AVC all-eye on the C70 and RAW on the C300 Mark III, and we could actually match these two absolutely perfectly if we wanted to. So this is definitely good to know when it comes to the C70, as the sensor is basically the same. You get a perfect B cam for the C300 Mark III when it comes to the quality. Unfortunately, this concludes my image quality test as it started raining and we weren't able to do some more slow motion tests. I wanted to pin the 100 frames, 120 frames, or even the 180 frames of the C300 Mark III against the ones on the C70, because here you might actually see a bigger difference when it comes to the higher compression rates, because the more frames you have, the more evident the lower bitrate might actually get. And I will have to do this another time because, as I already mentioned, I had to return the camera, so this is to be determined in the future. So next up is the autofocus test, and I was assured that the C70 has a better autofocus than the C300 Mark III and has a deep learning AI algorithm like the R5 has. And I couldn't confirm this in my first impression video, so I did a test comparing it to the C300 Mark III, and I still can't confirm it. Granted, this is still a pre-production model and this might be subject to change, but honestly, I can't really imagine that there will be a drastic difference all of a sudden to the C300 Mark III. And when it comes to our just basic tests where I had Belle just stand in front of the camera and just turning around or just standing there, I really did get a lot of missed autofocus scenarios, and they were basically the same on both cameras. And that already concludes our little test, and I did a lot more testing and I found out some small things about the rigging of the camera or putting it on a gimbal and the design and how to work with this camera, but I felt it wasn't really the right time to put this into an entire video. And I will get my hands on one in the near future again, and then I will produce something cool with the camera like we've been doing before. So I really get a feel for how this camera is actually behaving out in the field and if I could actually see myself using this as an A-cam. So stay tuned for this and also subscribe to the channel if you want to see that, or all our other comparisons and camera reviews that are coming up in the very near future. And I hope to see you in the next one.